Thank you for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates and our Webinar Wednesday program, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department, and we've been moving sequentially. So we started with DFARS Part 201 in January, and we will be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and they are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. And in the interest of time, we do not take questions. If you do have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what PTACs can offer. Set-aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources sought and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. And please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings. And you can contact Alicia Fields with the email shown on your screen if you have any questions. Federal contracting is a relationship game. Now get in front of your federal humans sooner with the exclusive Players and Layers method from Judy Bratt and Summit Insight. Connect with her on LinkedIn and find out more, or visit growfedbiz.com today. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and more information can be found on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we're holding this year. We've launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. And this is a live webinar series held each month. And these will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. And we've assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen, and then we'll take your live questions about that topic. So, for example, our panelists covered proposal writing this month, and next month, on August 13th, our panelists will be covering compliance. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals, and you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available for these webinars. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. Also, please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each of these webinars. Okay, now to introduce our speaker, Nick Sanfilippo. Welcome, Nick. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Hunter. I appreciate it. A little bit about myself. I'm a partner at McGuire Woods. I work primarily in the labor and employment group, although I do handle some bid protest work and primarily work in the government contractor field in terms of my client base. Most of my clients are government contractors. So I do have quite a bit of familiarity with these issues, usually on the bid protest side. Hunter, if you could go to the next slide, please. So, this webinar is on DFARS Part 231, Contract Cost Principles and Procedures. If you're expecting something else, you're in the wrong place. Next slide, please. So DFARS 252.231-7000 states that when allowability of costs under this contract is determined in accordance with Part 31 of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, allowability shall also be determined in accordance with Part 231 of the Defense FAR Supplement in effect of this on the date of this contract. In other words, costs under a government contract are reimbursable only if they're allowable. And the allowability of government contract costs is governed by the contract cost principles and procedures contained in FAR Part 31. So, when you're pricing your contract and when you're especially costing out your contract and submitting costs for reimbursement under a contract, it's important to determine if they are allowable, and that's what FAR Part 31 helps you determine. Next slide. So why is FAR Part 31 important? Well, the primary means of defining the costs that will be considered allowable by the government in the negotiation and the administration of its contracts can be found in FAR Part 31. The government uses these principles to measure what it will pay a particular contractor under cost reimbursement or incentive fee type contracts, and also to determine the extent of pricing adjustments under fixed price contracts. Cost principles establish basic guidelines for the allowability of costs, and they also delineate specific categories of allowable and unallowable costs. So if you're trying to determine whether your cost is allowable, Part 31 will help you determine that. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that FAR Part 31 is the primary source, but not the only one for cost principles. Individual agencies can supplement the FAR cost principles with their own regulations. In addition, individual and class deviations from FAR Part 31 are possible under certain circumstances. However, these deviations are pretty rare, as they are given that there's a requirement for advanced approval by designated agency officials. So for the most part, what you're going to be dealing with in terms of cost principles is just what's laid out in FAR Part 31. Next slide. FAR Part 31 cost principles are most important with regard to the allowability of costs expended under cost reimbursement or incentive fee contracts. So, flat fee contracts, you're not going to have to worry too much about this because obviously they're just paying you for one fee. But cost reimbursement or cost plus contracts and incentive fee contracts do require attention to the allowability of costs. As a result, cost principles are most relevant to contract administration once you win a contract, getting paid. But they should certainly be considered when you're forming a contract, because if the costs laid out in the contract are not allowable, or if you don't cost the contract appropriately, you can either end up in a situation where you don't get paid or you don't get paid enough to cover the cost of the contract. In fixed price contracts, parties agree to a firm price, so, not an adjustable price. So cost principles come into play under such contracts when changes are negotiated or when the contract is terminated, but won't come into play generally if the contract is successfully completed without changes. Next slide. So when are these rules applicable? Although the extent to which the cost principles come into play depends in large part on the type of contract awarded, fixed price versus cost reimbursement, FAR Part 31 requires the incorporation of the cost principles into all contracts where A, cost analysis is performed, as well as B, where a contract clause requires the determination, negotiation, or allowance of costs. So that's the language you're going to want to look for in your contract to determine whether you're going to need to pay attention to Part 31. Next slide. So, cost analysis, that was one of the triggers in the last slide. Well, what is that? It's defined by FAR 15.401-1C. Cost analysis involves the evaluation of the judgmental factors used by the contractor in estimating costs. In other words, they're going to look at what you did to determine the cost estimates. Cost analysis is what distinguishes cost-based acquisition, in which contracts are based on costs incurred or projected to be incurred by the contractor, from price-based acquisition, in which contractual relationships are established using price instead of cost. I assume everyone here is familiar with the difference between price-based acquisition and cost-based acquisition. But cost-based acquisition, they look at the cost and then they'll add a plus. Under price-based acquisition, they're just going to pay the final price for a good. So a price-based acquisition typically is something that's involved with buying a product. If the government is going out to buy a product, going out to buy flashlights, say, they'll just look at the price, for 100 flashlights, and whoever has the best product at the best price, they'll pay that price and you're done. Cost-based acquisition has more to do with generally providing services, construction, things like that, where they're paying for the costs involved in the contract and then a premium to the contractor for the work that they're providing. Cost analysis is required to be used for evaluating the reasonableness of individual elements of cost whenever cost or pricing data are required under the Truth in Negotiations Act, and may be used to evaluate information other than cost or pricing data to determine cost reasonableness or cost realism. If your contract is governed by the Truth in Negotiations Act, you will know that up front. Where these tend to come into play a lot will be when there's a challenge to cost or pricing data. The government will want to say, well, those costs aren't reasonable, and then you may have to perform a cost analysis to show the government why your costs are reasonable. Cost analysis is frequently used, and the cost principles therefore apply in the pricing of both cost reimbursing and fixed price contracts, subcontracts, and modifications. You'll have to show your cost analysis when you're showing your fixed price, in justifying your fixed price. So, it's the kind of thing that you're going to have to get comfortable performing and defending. Next slide, please. The next part of FAR Part 31 is determination, negotiation, or allowance of costs. This means that the contracting officer is required to incorporate the cross principles of Subpart 31.2 procedures by reference in contracts with commercial organizations as the basis for all 6 of these factors. So if the contracting officer needs to determine reasonable reimbursable costs under cost reimbursement contracts and subcontracts, they'll look at FAR Part 31.2. If they're negotiating indirect cost rates, proposing, negotiating, or determining costs under terminated contracts, price revision of fixed price incentive contracts, price redetermination of price redetermination contracts, and pricing changes and other contract modifications. These are all circumstances where FAR Part 31 will come into play. Next slide. Okay, so under FAR Part 31, there are 4 sets of cost principles governing commercial organizations, educational institutions, state, local, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments, and contracts, grants, and agreements with nonprofit organizations. The one that affects almost everyone and that you'll see more than others by far is 31.2, dealing with commercial organizations. These are the cost principles that govern contracts that the government uses with any government contractor, essentially, unless you are a Native American corporation or Indian tribal government, or you're a nonprofit or an educational institution. Those are much more specialized contracts. Your typical contract that you're going to be dealing with the government will be governed by 31.2 for commercial organizations. Next one. So why is it structured this way? Well, the cost principles and procedures in the succeeding subparts are grouped by organizational type in recognition of differing organizational characteristics. The overall objective is to provide that, to the extent practicable, all organizations of similar types doing similar work will follow the same cost principles and procedures. As I said previously, 31.2 governing contracts with commercial organizations is by far the most frequently used. It's the most extensive, but it's also the one that will be subject of this, that will cover most contracts, since it covers supply, service, and construction contracts. Next slide. So contracts with commercial organizations, including contracts and modifications for supplies, services, or experimental, developmental, or research work negotiated with organizations other than educational institutions, state, local, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments, are governed by 31.2. Note that the cost principles for contracts with educational institutions, state, local, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments are contained in various OMB circulars incorporated by reference in FAR subparts 31.3 through 31.7. So if you are having to run cost analysis for one of these other organizations, you're going to want to make sure you pay attention to these OMB circulars as well as the subparts. Next slide. Okay, so getting into the heart of this, FAR subpart 31.2 lists 5 general factors for determining cost allowability: reasonableness, allocability, and then the next 3, standards promulgated by the CAS, which is the Cost Accounting Standards Board, if applicable, otherwise generally accepted accounting principles and practices appropriate to the particular circumstances, the terms of the contract, and any limitations set forth in this subpart. So basically, usually when you get down to the brass tacks of this, you're going to be in a situation where the terms of the contract isn't clear. The limitations set forth in the subpart don't govern the costing of it. It's not something that's specifically not allocable or allowable. The standards promulgated by generally accepted accounting principles don't really tell you what to do in this situation. And then you're going to be left with reasonableness and allocability. Those are the 2 that have the most flux in them and have the most fudge room. So those are the ones that you end up fighting for. Generally accepted accounting principles and practices, I mean, you could do an entire webinar series on that. That's not something I'm going to be covering today. And the terms of the contract are going to be, ultimately very specific to each contract. So that's, again, not something I'm going to be talking about today. The limitations set forth in the subpart we'll be talking about later. There are some costs that are just not allowable. But now we're going to get into reasonableness and allocability. One thing, though, to keep in mind before we do that is that the government bears the burden of proving that the costs are of the type made specifically unallowable by regulation or contract term. So the government bears the burden of proving that the costs are unallowable. Otherwise, they would be considered allowable. Next slide, please. So reasonableness. The criteria for determining whether a cost is reasonable are necessarily open-ended and subjective. The FAR provides that a cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person in the conduct of competitive business. In determining whether a cost is reasonable, a number of considerations will be reviewed, including the contractor's, quote, responsibilities to the government, other customers, the owners of the business, employees, and the public at large. So what does this mean? This means that basically the cost that you're paying needs to be reasonable in terms of what a business owner would think about the cost. So let's take one cost, for instance, and say labor. That's one that I'm familiar with as a labor and employment lawyer. If you are paying your people an exorbitant rate that is far beyond what a competitive rate is for the area that you're working in. I mean, what a competitive rate is in Manhattan may be very different from what a competitive rate is in rural North Dakota. So there are tables that say what competitive labor rates are, what the standard labor rates are for many different job categories. If you're paying people, much beyond what those standard rates are, then you may face a challenge that your rates are not reasonable. If you're buying materials at a rate that is far above the market rate for those materials, again, you may face a challenge. So a lot of these analyses are obviously very specific, but the lens that they're going to look at is, what would a prudent person pay for these costs, for these items? Now there is a little bit of leeway given in there if you are marking things up, because they do consider the owner of the business, the employees. So there is some fluff given in there for profit margin. But if you're running a very high profit margin or even a moderately high profit margin as compared to your competitors, you may not end up getting having the cost be allowable. Or if you're paying much higher than market rate for a cost, it may not be allowable, or at least fully allowable. They may allow it only partially, so that to pay you the market rate or to pay you the standard wage rate instead of the wage rate that you're actually paying. Next slide. So a contractor's incurred costs for FAR Part 31 covered contracts are not presumed to be reasonable. Rather, the burden of proof shall be upon the contractor to establish that such cost is reasonable. However, a contractor's decision regarding its business affairs will be accorded some deference. Where it has been successful in challenging a cost reasonableness, the government has usually been able to establish that a contractor abused its discretion, such as where a contractor retained a large unproductive workforce for longer than was prudent under the circumstances, or where the contractor incurred excessive promotional costs in connection with preparing an unsolicited proposal. So, I mean, we get to the first general quandary in this, is that, the government bears the burden of proving that it's unreasonable, but it's not presumed to be reasonable. And then later it says that the contractor has to establish that such cost is reasonable. Basically here, if your costs are unreasonable, you're probably not going to win an argument with the government if they don't want to pay you. So, you have to be careful to monitor your costs, make sure that they're reasonable, make sure that you're paying market rates, and make sure that you're not overpaying for things, or you won't be reimbursed for them. Next slide. The second factor was allocability. Allocation of costs is the process of assigning costs to cost objectives. The FAR cost principles contain the following definition of allocability. A cost is allocable if it is assignable or chargeable to one or more cost objectives on the basis of relative benefits received or other equitable relationship. Subject to the foregoing, a cost is allocable to a government contract if it A, is incurred specifically for the contract, B, benefits both the contract and other work and can be distributed to them in reasonable proportion to the benefits received, or C, is necessary to the overall operation of the business, although a direct relationship to any particular cost objective cannot be shown. So, A is pretty obvious, right? If you incur a cost specifically for the contract, then you can allocate that to the contract. If it benefits both the contract and other work, then you can allocate it to the contract if you can reasonably determine the proportion that is being used for one contract. A good example of this would be if you're buying, bulk steel, and you have multiple construction jobs going on, and you can easily determine that X amount of steel is being used for this contract, X amount compared to the whole, and divide that by the cost of the whole, and say that the cost of the steel that's being used for this contract is Y. Then you can allocate that portion to the contract. You can't allocate the whole portion, but the part that you can reasonably determine to the contract can be allocated. C, it's necessary to the overall operation of the business, although a direct relationship to any particular cost objective cannot be shown. This would be your maybe back office people who spend some time working on a contract, but the direct relationship cannot be shown. They're doing accounting or whatever. You can allocate those costs if they're reasonable, if they're allowable under the other factors, like allowable under the contract, et cetera. But they're going to be harder to show. You're more likely to get pushed back under C than the other two factors, assuming you've done the math right under B. Next slide, please. For contracts with commercial organizations, the total cost of the contract is the sum of the direct and indirect costs incurred or to be incurred that are allocable to the contract, less any allocable credits, plus any allocable cost of money determined in accordance with FAR 31.20510. That is a formula, a math formula. I'll leave it there for you to digest. But the key takeaway is that in determining questions of allocability, is necessary to assess whether a cost should be charged directly or indirectly. The FAR defines a direct cost as any cost that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective. The provision goes on to say that costs identified specifically with the contract are direct costs of the contract and are to be charged directly to the contract. And all costs specifically identified with other final cost objectives of the contract are direct costs of those cost objectives and are not to be charged to the contract directly or indirectly. So if it's a cost that is not allocable to the contract because it's more indirect, then you can't charge it directly to the contract. I mean, I don't know how else to say that, how to better say that. It's a mouthful, but basically if you can't draw a line between a cost and the final cost objective of the contract, you can't charge it to the contract. Next slide. Direct costs. The FAR defines a direct cost as any cost that is identified specifically with a particular final cost objective. Costs incurred for materials, labor, or other purposes that are clearly necessary for performing a particular contract are direct costs of the contract. Even if an expenditure is eventually determined to have been unnecessary for contract performance, the cost will nonetheless be allocable as a direct charge if the contractor reasonably believed it was necessary when it decided to incur the cost. The legal test is sometimes referred to as the but-for test, i.e., the cost would not have been incurred but for the existence of the contract. If you're incurring costs that do not have a but-for cost, they're likely to be found unallocable. Next slide. Indirect costs. So the FAR defines an indirect cost as one not directly identified with a single final cost objective, but identified with 2 or more final cost objectives or an immediate cost objective. The provision requires that indirect costs shall be accumulated by logical cost groupings with due consideration of the reasons for incurring such costs. Based on this definition, commonly, manufacturing overhead, selling expenses, and general and administrative expenses are separately grouped. So these are your back office folks, selling expenses, etc. They're indirect costs, you know, and they can be allocable, but usually only on a proportionate basis. Next slide. In addition to describing the general rules on cost allowability, the FAR cost principles also select particular costs for special treatment. So these selected costs must not only meet the general requirements for allowability, they must also meet other special criteria. Even if a particular expenditure is eminently reasonable and allocable, it will be unallowable if the selected cost provisions label it as such. This, a lot of times, will be determined by your contract. If you go to the next slide, we could talk. I think once you see the examples, it's easier to understand. So public relations and advertising costs, for example. You can't charge advertising costs or public relations costs to a contract unless for the procurement of scarce items needed for performance of the contract or the disposal of scrap or surplus materials required during performance. So in other words, generally not allowable, but if it falls into a specific category permitted under the contract or under the these 2 categories, then it can be allowable if, again, reasonable and all that stuff. So just be aware of that. Next slide. So personal services. Special forms of compensation for personal services are singled out in the selected cost provision for individual treatment. Compensation for personal services, which is broadly defined as all remuneration paid currently or accrued in whatever form and whether paid immediately or deferred for services rendered by employees to the contractor during the period of contract performance, are generally allowable if reasonable in amount for the work performed. So if you have arm's length negotiated labor management agreements, or if you have to pay someone severance pay or dismissal wages or back pay resulting from underpaid work, that all can be allowable to the contract if it's related to the contract, directly related to the contract. And that's, of course, in addition to direct wages that are paid for work performed on the contract. So, you know, those are treated a little bit differently. There's a little bit more leeway to contractors to pay out their employees under these contracts if it's reasonable in amount for the work performed and if it falls into one of these categories. Next slide. Independent research and development and bid and proposal costs are allowable as indirect expenses to the extent that they are reasonable and allocable. So allocable meaning that they're directly related to the contract. So the DFARS cost principles, in an effort to encourage industry-initiated IR&D efforts, provide that these costs are allowable only when I say these costs, I mean research and development costs, are allowable only when expended for projects, quote, that are of potential interest to DoD, including activities that strengthen the nation's defense, industrial, and technology base and enhance its industrial competitiveness, promote the development of technologies identified by DoD as critical, increase the development of technologies useful for both the private, commercial, and public sectors, dual-use technologies such as the microwave, for example, probably the most famous one, and develop efficient and effective technologies for achieving such environmental benefits as improved data gathering, cleanup and restoration, pollution reduction in manufacturing, environmental conservation, and environmentally safe management of facilities. So the takeaway is that research and development, although not usually a direct cost, can be reimbursable, but it's got to be related to one of these categories typically, if you're working on a contract where you're doing the kind of R&D that would fall into these categories, you'll know it. This would be your defense contractors developing the next super weapon or whatever. But not necessarily just that. It could be something like more efficient use of energy. You're going to want to look at contact the DoD, figure out what their critical technologies are. They publish that information. If you can find that out and your R&D is going towards that and you can make a good case for it, it's possible that your R&D could be reimbursable. Next slide. Insurance and indemnification. Basically, the thing to know is that reasonable insurance costs are generally allowable subject to certain restrictions, but indemnification costs are allowable only if the contract so provides. The cost of insuring government property, it's allowable only to the extent that the contractor is, one, liable for its loss or damage, and the insurance cannot cover loss or damage resulting from willful misconduct or lack of good faith of the contractor's directors, officers, or equivalent representatives. The government will not allow you off the hook on those things. Next slide. Lobbying costs are generally not reimbursable. They're unallowable. So if you're trying to, influence or encourage others to influence legislative officials to favor or oppose legislation, that is not an allowable cost. Next slide. That's it. The FAR Part 31 is pretty basic in the sense that what it does is it tells you, the general rules for costing. Now, if you actually get into some kind of dispute on this, or if you have thorny issues of is this allowed, isn't this allowed, well, those are all individualized analyses that have to be performed. It's real easy to do an overview of the rules, but the proof is in the pudding a lot of times on this stuff. You have to really dive in and do the analysis for each individual cost. There's a lot of different case law out there from, the ALJs and such on this. So, you're going to want to do the research and figure out what's allowable and what's not allowable on each and every instance. If you do have any questions as a result of anything I've said today, please feel free to reach me. My contact information is here on this page. I'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for a great presentation and for sharing your time with us today. And like he said, feel free to reach out to him with any questions. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more parts of the DFARS. Have a good week, everyone.